The limit. There's something oddly fascinating about the limit. And when I'm talking about the limit, I'm talking about the human limit. We as humans are fascinated with the idea of the most. What's the fastest car we can build? The stupidest speedrun categories to finish? How strong can we get? How fast can we run? We implicitly look for the most in nearly every situation. This concept is no stranger to music. In fact, my most successful video to this date was essentially an hour-long session of me waxing lyrical about a genre that pushed the limits of sound. Although humanity is fascinated with the concept of the most, or the limit, the way individuals go about fulfilling those desires are often different. I found myself enthralled in a particular subgenre of death metal more aptly named brutal death metal, and everything from imagery, production, and lyricism was so comically violent I wondered how far it could go. I was fascinated that, although the intention of the genre is to push brutality, there still straddles a line between intensity and groove. In a manner, the musicians behind the BDM genre seek to push the limits of listenable music through controlling the chaos. This phenomena intrigued me, and what was even more interesting was why yours truly and many other people found themselves enjoying such a crass and hostile genre, where the goals of both the listeners and the artist was to make the music as brutal as possible, something along the lines of the pursuit of brutality. Logically, to understand the history of brutal death metal, we have to contextualize its parent genre, death metal, and some cross-pollination-esque influences from grindcore. In Mudrian and Peel's book, Choosing Death, they dive deep into the history of grindcore and death metal by archiving first-person accounts. There's a general narrative between both genres that would become the ethos of BDM down the line, which is to push the extremities of the music. In Chapter 1, Punk is a Rotting Corpse, Mudrian explains that the punk rock explosion was born from the frustrated working-class youth found in places such as UK's Birmingham and US's New York, where making music was less about technical skill and more so an outlet to vent. UK's finest, Napalm Death, popularized pushing the speed and percussive intensity present in the genre, and their 87 LP Scum, released on the infamous Earache Records label, is one of the most prominent and early examples of grindcore. Grindcore, being the genre that attempted to merge extreme metal with hardcore punk, prioritized the speed and heaviness in the genre. Tony Bones Roberts, the guitarist from Discharge, another big player in the development of grindcore, claimed there are a lot of angry people over here. For them, the Sex Pistols and the Clash just didn't cut it. It was the same for us. When we first started, we sounded like Sex Pistols, but we just started rehearsing more and came up with something different, something heavier and faster. I've talked to a lot of people that were playing in bands that just sounded like Clash and the Sex Pistols at the time, but when they heard us, they started playing more hardcore, like the Discharge stuff. From this, we can trace a long line of grindcore that developed alongside death metal, where the two genres would periodically influence each other yet grow in parallel. Brutal death metal takes a lot of the speed, violence, and low-fidelity production seen in grindcore. In Chapter 3's Death by Metal, we get to see the fetal stages of death metal and a few key bands on the opposite side of the US's coast in California and Florida. Infamous band Death was formed in Florida, where guitarist Chuck Schuldiner claims his main goal was to bash out the most brutal riffs ever with the most brutal guitar sound ever. Once again, we can see the theme of the limit being the driving force behind the continuous development of the artists' respective genres. This encapsulated in their first full-length album, Scream Bloody Gore, released in '87, where the project was onboarded by a slew of demos, such as Death by Metal a few years prior in '84. Many other bands around the time would share the same ideology, such as Morbid Angel, Obituary, Immolation, etc. A notable California project dubbed Possessed released their album in '85, Seven Churches. Many consider this to be the first death metal project, as the term was coined in the last track along with their first demo in '84. Lead singer of the band, Jeff Becerra, claimed that, "We were playing this music and we were trying to be the heaviest thing on the face of the planet. We just wanted to piss people off and send everybody home, and that can't be like flower metal." We see from time and time again that the main goal of these bands was to push the limits of sound. The pursuit of brutality was slowly gradient into brutal death metal, first spotted in the early 90s, where production techniques and signature riffs would slowly synthesize themselves into one of the first shining examples of brutal death metal: suffocation. Let's fast forward to the year 1991, where Suffocation would release their first EP, Human Waste, a simple 6-song project that acted as the proof of concept for the brutal death metal genre. Although the EP had subpar production quality, the dynamic riffing and drum work was pretty unique for the time, with a 2003 review saying, "If you like brutal death metal and don't own this, buy it. If you don't like Suffocation, castrate yourself, as your genitals are obviously functionless." Following Human Waste, Suffocation would go on to make their most infamous album in the same year titled Effigy of the Forgotten. Effigy of the Forgotten was a different breed of metal for the time, and is where many considered it the genesis of brutal death metal. A creative mix of riffs and tempo changes allowed the band to constantly keep the listener involved. Fast blast beats would suddenly come to a chugging halt. Frequent and technical guitars thrashed the listener to and fro. To quote a 2009 review from metalreviews.com, "Sure, more brutal music has been produced since then, but Suffocation's attitude, that sheer 'I'm going to stab you in the eye with a rusty steak knife dipped in AIDS-infected blood' mentality has never been matched as far as I'm concerned, and never will be matched, because Suffocation did it first." Notice the language of first. Although we can argue that other bands are starting to formulate a brutal style before Suffocation, this band is the most prominent example of that cultural shift to brutal death metal. If we attempted to demarcate the gradient that is the history of brutal death metal, this is where it started to become noticeable. This example materializes in a riff technique that would spawn a whole microgenre that BDM would start to foster, that being the slam riff found within just the first track. The slam is a palm-muted riff that is typically slow, chuggy, chromatic, and rhythmic. The utilization of a slam is to create a sense of groove in a BDM track. It adds a sludgy texture to the song that is conducive to headbanging. It should be noted that not every brutal death metal song includes a slam, but it ends up being so common that it has become synonymous with the genre. Bands choose how much they want to emphasize this riff in their music, with some bands banging them out so much that they lose much of the percussive intensity in favor for the groove. Once again, the template of Suffocation traces into BDM, where there is an apparent ebb and flow for the brutality in the music. Despite the usage of the slam in Liege of Veracity, Suffocation only catalyzed the partial birth of slamming brutal death metal, but where slam started to embed into the DNA of the genre really started with Internal Bleeding. Self-proclaimed to be the inventors of the slam genre, their case is backed up by their phenomenal 1995 debut album Voracious Contempt. Compared to the technical brutality found on Liege of Veracity, Internal Bleeding's version of brutal death metal focuses on the bouncier, chuggier parts of the genre. Production played a huge part in this album, as the combination of distorted riffs, deep gutturals, and plucky bass turned the album to be much groovier than its previous contemporaries. The band isn't just a one-trick pony either. Their discography shows that they can play around with the continuum inherent in brutal death metal. 97's The Extinction of Malevolence ends up being one of their more brutal outings, when in just 2 years, Driven to Conquer takes a more hardcore approach to the music. Internal Bleeding lays down the blueprint for slamming brutal death metal, showcasing that creativity, heaviness, and bounciness are fundamental to creating this style. Flavors of slam would start to be seen around the late 90s and early 2000s, when bands really started to consider how clean or dirty their production should really be, along with how to still incorporate speed along with the inherently slow riff. Texas's Devourment paved the way for one of the most brutal albums ever conceived in 1999 with Molesting the Decapitated, a divisive work that continues to act as the stopgap for how listenable this genre can get. Everything about this album assaults the user, from the headless cadaver art piece from Joel Peter Witkin to the intense grindy sections punctuated with muddy distorted riffing. The gutturals on Molesting the Decapitated acts as another instrument to complement the rest of the song, with lyrics becoming nigh incomprehensible, a signature sound that persists within brutal death metal vocals. Reviews find this album to be polarizing, with some users claiming it to be the best slamming brutal death metal ever, with only cheap clones following in its footsteps. Contrary opinions often called the album lazy, with poor production and a lack of technical skill. Devourment, and their brand of slamming BDM, contains qualities that many people both praise and criticize them for. Despite this, without Devourment, the development of slam would have been completely different or even non-existent. And no matter how much people may despise or love the slam riff, its prevalence in brutal death metal is almost fundamental to its existence. Although the infamous riff has become conducive to much of brutal death metal sound, not every shining example utilizes it enough to be categorically defined as such. Once again, tracing back to Liege of Inveracity, the blueprint that was laid was a continuum between fast brutality and slow chugging riffage. In the pursuit of brutality, the slam was meant to act as a musical equivalent to a heavy and pounding sledgehammer. On the contrary, the other school of brutal death metal wanted to explore the more technical options. No one does this better, in my opinion, than Canada's own Cryptopsy. The story of Cryptopsy's fame arises with their 1994 debut, Blasphemy Made Flesh, a fast and punishing piece of work which perfectly encapsulates the more technical side of BDM. None So Vile, their follow-up album, would continue to push the boundaries of speed and aggression, instantly becoming the crown jewel of their discography. Two notable aspects of this early era for the band was the percussive prowess of drummer Flo Mounier and infamous vocalist Lord Worm. Flo manages to continuously balance rhythm and speed to complement the hectic guitar solos and riffage. Lord Worm on vocals exhibits a range from deep growls to high-pitched screams that sound nearly animalistic. Not to mention the diverse and creative riffs backed up by similarly enthusiastic bass. Cryptopsy made a brutal death metal classic from song to song, back to back. Cryptopsy would have a somewhat shaky discography after None So Vile, as Lord Worm would drop vocals after the debut album, and fans would miss his signature growls and screeches in later works such as Whisper Supremacy. Experimentation with other metal genres in outings such as And Then You'll Beg and The Unspoken King left fans questioning where the original sound they once heard in '96 went. Lord Worm briefly returned for one of their underrated releases, Once Was Not, and currently they cleaned up the production, attempting to retrace their steps in As Gomorrah Burns with more technical flair. The technicality present in brutal death metal would continue on into acts such as Malignancy's intrauterine cannibalism and Mortal Decay's sickening and erotic fanaticism, where both the production and lyrical content would continue to get more and more disturbing and absurd. The apex of technicality and brutality, I believe, is found in Defeated Sanity, founded by drummer Lily Gruber and his father Wolfgang Teske, who took technical jazz influences into the brutal death metal scene. Their most notable outing, Psalms of the Moribund, would propel Defeated Sanity into being brutal death metal royalty, taking the concept of brutality and satisfying critics who claimed the genre was too stupid and one note. Despite the advent of technical brutal death metal through None So Vile, other acts were pushing for a less slam-forward sound whilst still maintaining their own identity. Dying Fetus would release their own debut titled Purification Through Violence, inciting hardcore influences into the music. Not only did they do this by taking the speed and riffing of the adjacent genre, but also by utilizing similar political themes. On the opposite side of the spectrum, sometimes brutal death metal doesn't take itself too seriously, more so bordering on comical extremes rather than shock and fear. Skinless's progression towards evil features groove that is signature to New York death metal, but their ridiculous lyricism is sported in tracks such as Tampon Lollipops and Scum Cookie. Hyperbolic titles would become a mainstay, especially in the slamming brutal death metal scene, where we have acts such as Ecchymosis naming songs Cephalic Ingestion of Newborn Chunks or Aberrant Amusement in Cadaveric Vomit Play, both are which still excellent tracks. In 1999, we saw the release of Mortal Decay's second album, Forensic, which attempts to twist and abstract away from technical techniques found in the genre. To quote a 2011 review, there's really not a ton of straightforward material on this. Yes, it's blast heavy on certain tracks, but overall this refuses to play by the established rules of brutal death. There are not normal riffs. Everything has been twisted with a bend, a bit of vibrato, or some other off-putting technical flair. This is merely a part of what makes albums such as Forensic so disturbing, as vocals and lyrical content also contributes to the maddening album. The track Chronicles is written from the first-person perspective of a deranged serial killer. Other acts such as Regurgitation takes a more straightforward approach, embracing the gore present in tales of necrophilia. Lyricism is often accompanied in rhyme scheme and some poetic techniques, despite not a single word being decipherable to the listener. Creativity is not only limited to the sonic and lyrical qualities, but also thematic ones as well. Brodekin is a Tennessee brutal death metal project that focuses on historical methods of torture from the medieval era. The band is so dedicated to this theme that lead singer and bassist Jamie Bailey is able to flex his history degree into lyricism. He goes on to say that there simply was no point in history that was more brutal than the medieval period. At the same time that such barbarity was developed, there was also an explosion in fine art, architecture, and music. It all comes to feed our identity as a band. His sentiment is reflected throughout the band's discography, with earlier works such as Instruments of Torture sporting low-fidelity production, and cleaner outings such as their recent Harbinger of Woe continuing to turn heads. One of the most polarizing parts of brutal death metal is, well, the sound. The biggest criticism of the genre is its over-the-top themes, production, and lyricism. Tracing back to Devourment's Molesting the Decapitated, the criticisms and praises for the music are often the same, with individual perspective being the defining factor for if the music is considered good. Zachary Wallmark understands this concept perfectly in The Sound of Evil, Timbre, Body, and Sacred Violence in Death Metal, a brief chapter in an overarching music theory book titled The Relentless Pursuit of Tone. Death metal is easy to mock. To many, this gore-obsessed genre is simply a fundamentalist caricature of everything hypermasculine, risibly puerile, and utterly ridiculous about death metal. Death metal has provoked a range of highly emotional reactions from fear to disgust, rage, and ridicule. To many rock critics and music lovers, it is normal metal pushed overboard by a juvenile fixation on being extreme to the detriment of good taste and listenability. But it is for these exact reasons that the genre has continued to have staying power over the years. The overarching musical ferocity is what makes death metal, and by extension brutal death metal, the genre that continues to simultaneously disgust and appeal to listeners. Once again, to quote Wallmark, more than any other single parameter, this timbral palette acts in complex and sometimes surprising ways to articulate a range of meanings in this often misunderstood genre. Let's start off with engineering. Brutal death metal musicians want to push the most brutal sound possible, whilst still maintaining a semblance of technical mastery and groove. To do this, bands have to simulate the sound of evil. Amplifier overdrive is a common technique, where musicians distort the sounds of their strings beyond the normal limit, which creates a sense of high volume to the listener. It's a clever technique because instead of just physically raising the decibels to create that feeling of intensity, volume is more so treated as a method of transmitting the feeling of excessive noise, even at normal listening levels. Distortion is the brutal death metal artist's bread and butter, as it stimulates a sense of violence to the listener because the musician can sonically materialize a sense of risk and danger. It plays at the edge of failure, teetering on the verge of collapse, yet always somehow managing to make it through. It's this continuous element of risk that makes listening and playing brutal death metal so satisfying. In classical death metal, this violence is typically backed up by the scoop EQ, which puts heavy emphasis on the lows and highs, subduing the mids to make brighter guitars and punchier drums. Brutal death metal, on the other hand, does terrible production as an aesthetic choice or out of necessity for the DIY nature. So things such as EQ and mixing become afterthoughts in exchange for what is believed to be a more raw and authentic sound. In death metal, the vocals, more than anything else, serve as the shibboleth to demarcate the borders of a noise-identified community. Only the strong can withstand the ugliness and brutality of the sui genre's timbre. It's a statement that can be parsed down into this comment left under a digested flesh track. This probably equivalent to loving scat porn. And it's perfect. Grit on my face, world has nothing on me. Vocals have to match the unrelenting brutality present in both the drum work and the guitars. Dying Fetus's Eric Syngenta amplifies this point, claiming that death metal is for the music, not the lyrics. The lyrics just cover the aggression that's heard in the music. The death growl was made out of necessity as a natural conclusion to the rest of the production. To add some variety, the death growl is just one of many techniques bands use to accompany the constant flux of a track. Tracks will often switch between growls, grunts, squeals, and screams. These vocals require technical skill to constantly replicate and have to be done properly in order not to injure the singer. Death metal vocals are so polarizing because they manage to tap into cultural superstitions regarding deep growls being associated with demonic possession, primal rage, or a feral animal. This triggers that fight or flight response that steals the attention of the listener to their dismay or pleasure. For a brutal death metal enthusiast, the enjoyment of the music comes from sonic qualities, production preferences, the continuum between intensity and groove, and the thematic qualities present in a band. The pursuit of brutality is most tangible when viewing artists over the years pushing for heavier riffing, faster percussion, scarier vocals, and a more creative utilization of production techniques and themes. Despite this, a lot of old acts continue to hold up to this day alongside the music, testament to how brutality diversifies rather than progresses. The chief question constantly proposed to metalheads is, why even bother listening to the music in the first place? And the answer I found ended up being twofold. First, metal is a genre that is more conducive to sensation-seeking individuals. Second, brutal death metal ends up being an important part of one's identity. Let's zoom out and first define the concept of sensation seeking. The Dark Side of Personality is a psychology book that studies the dark triad, a set of human behaviors deemed manipulative and selfish. Chapter 7's A Review of Sensation Seeking and its Empirical Correlates, Dark, Bright, and Neutral Hues, gives us insight into what sensation seeking exactly is, where the book defines it as the need for varied, novel, and complex sensations and experiences, such as the willingness to take physical and social risk for the sake of such experiences. We are then introduced to a sort of continuum, where this thrill-seeking attitude manifests into reality. Adaptive measures are socially acceptable methods of thrill-seeking, such as civic engagement, military service, exploration of nature, and cognitive creativity. In many cases, these benefit the user and society as a whole. Neutral thrill-seeking involves engagement with communities that does not typically affect the broader culture around it, such as sports communities or groups with shared aesthetic preferences in art. Maladaptive traits manifest into what are typically considered bad actions, such as riskier sex, antisocial or violent behaviors, gambling, and drug abuse. Consequently, listening to brutal death metal can be classified as a neutral method of sensation seeking, where an underground community mostly keeps to themselves, an abrasive and extreme music genre that may be considered a social risk when observed by outsiders. We can also call back to the timbre of death metal, where heavy distortion, volume, and vocals simulate the fight or flight response that we can attribute to the physical risk taken in sensation seeking. Individuals high in sensation seeking may pursue complex, discordant, or intense stimuli as a means of optimizing their level of arousal, where this can specifically apply to aesthetic preferences such as brutal death metal. Beyond just sensation seeking, individuals enjoy brutal death metal because it fosters an underground tight-knit community where they can feel special. A psychological study of the sacred in metal music culture talks about the importance of music for psychological needs, where, outside of empathy, music has been associated with higher levels of fulfillment of other psychological needs, including the regulation of arousal and mood, self-awareness, and as an expression of social relatedness. This aspect is especially important for the younger crowd, as they can establish cultural identity and form interpersonal relationships with people carrying common interest. For a young person, brutal death metal is one of the many unique avenues to establish your identity amongst a crowd. It's important to distinguish enjoyable music from sacred, where the former is enjoyed for secular reasons and the latter is enjoyed for religious reasons, the latter of which is more impactful on the psyche, with the assumption that sacred music is perceived at an experimental level of intensity above that of merely enjoyable music. A study was conducted where popular death metal songs and hard rock songs were introduced to death metal fans. This was designed to see if music they deemed sacred increased parasocial behavior and tensions over adjacent genres such as hard rock. The results indicate that perceiving secular music as sacred, both to the self and to the community that the user is a member of, is associated with higher levels of psychological needs fulfilled compared to music that is considered as enjoyable but not sacred. This provides evidence that death metal members are not only enjoying their preferred subgenre of music, but they're also connecting to it on a deeper level beyond enjoyment. That is the key statement that encapsulates why people enjoy such a harsh and offensive genre. The music in itself is a good case study of how musicians can stimulate and simulate the need for sensation-seeking impulses in certain individuals. How this is done sounds almost contrary. By utilizing unorthodox or incorrect techniques lies a demonstration of mastery and control over the chaos. It manages to convey risk in a sonic manner. On top of that, bands try to straddle the line between intensity and groove while simultaneously attempting to make the music more brutal. This factor is what distinctly separates brutal death metal from just harsh noise. A polarizing and healthy community is also what continues to foster loyal and knowledgeable fans. To a person looking to hone in their individuality, liking brutal death metal makes you distinct from an aesthetic standpoint. Simultaneously, as said individuals risk isolating themselves socially, they find the connections they do make in the community to be deep and interpersonal. This is Ruminate. Thank you for watching.